Do the same. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the Honourable Member Chris Hipkin.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm happy to rise to take a brief call on this Members of Parliament Remuneration and Services Bill. I want to, in a moment, get into a couple of issues with the drafting of the bill, which I hope the Select Committee will be able to clarify. But I think at the outset it's important to talk about the principles that lie behind this first. And I think we have seen a move to a much more transparent system for setting the non-salary components of services provided to members and entitlements, if we could use the word entitlements, provided to members over the last few years. And I think that's been a very welcome thing. I think the public have welcomed that. And I think it has led to a higher standard of accountability within the House. And I think that that is a very welcome thing. I think what we're doing in this bill is moving a step further, which is to institute a further degree of independence in the determination around some of these matters. At the moment, the Remuneration Authority already determine what salaries and allowances members are paid. This bill goes a step further and transfers to them the responsibility for also determining travel and accommodation related matters, and I think that that is also useful because those are the matters, as the Attorney General pointed out when he spoke, those are the matters in which members could also be deemed to have more of a personal interest. It leaves with the Speaker the responsibility for determining matters around member support for out-of-Parliament offices and for in-Parliament offices, areas where clearly there is unlikely to be any perception of members having a personal interest in those matters, so they remain with the Speaker. But what it is doing is it is instituting a further degree of independence in any matters where members may be perceived to have a personal interest. Although I would argue in the case of travel and accommodation payments, it's more perception than reality. And I say that as a Wellington Member of Parliament who doesn't qualify for Wellington accommodation. I do, however, qualify for travel, but have far less need to use it than a Member of Parliament who lives significantly further away than Wellington. And I will quite happily defend those Members of Parliament who do live outside the Wellington area, having that support. I think it's essential for them to do the job, that they are able to travel freely between Wellington and their home base and their constituency. In some cases, members need to use air travel within their constituency because the constituencies are so large, and I think that that's something that we also need to support. If you look at the case, for example, of Reno Tirakatni, the Labour member, he has the entire South Island and a chunk of Wellington in his constituency. For him, travel is essential just to meet the people from one end of his electorate to the other, let alone actually be in Wellington to execute his responsibilities to the House. So I think making sure that members can still have access to travel services that allow them to do the job is very, very important. Providing some degree of independence in how they are determined, I hope will remove any suggestion that members are benefiting personally from the provision of those. I would hate to get to the point where in order to serve a constituency effectively as a Member of Parliament, one had to have a large degree of personal wealth in order to be able to do the job. This is a House of Representatives, and as such we are going to have people from a diverse range of backgrounds, some of whom come in here with large personal wealth already, but some who don't, and some who come, I hope, from backgrounds that are far more modest than that, and they should still be able to do their jobs effectively without having to dip into their own pockets in order just to do the job. And I think that that's one of the really important principles that should be defended, and I hope by providing some more independence in this process we will be able to do that. Hey, having said that, providing independence is all very well. If things go wrong, we're still going to get the blame. And so we should be quite open about that. Whenever we get a pay rise, even though the pay rise is determined by an independent body, we still get blamed for that. And I don't think it's going to be any different when we transfer the travel and accommodation entitlement or the travel and accommodation services to the Remuneration Authority either. I do want to raise an issue around post-election arrangements, and it's a technical issue, but it's one that came up following the last election and one that I hope will be carefully considered in the consideration of this bill. And it relates to Members of Parliament who may be returned on election day, but then in the counting of further votes are out again. And This does not relate to the case of an electoral petition because there's a specific provision in the bill that deals with those members. This is a case where members are back and then they're out, or they might be out and then they're back. Now, if you're out and then you're back, that's not so bad because the pay, you can get your pay and everything. That's not so bad. But if you're in and then you're out, you actually may be in for 2, 3, 4 weeks after an election and continuing to be paid as a member, and then you might find yourself out. But the provisions in this bill with regard to what gets paid to former members and what they can access dates back to polling day, regardless of whether they have been a member of Parliament temporarily for some period of time immediately after polling day. And in the case of support services to members of Parliament, this becomes very important. To give the example of an out-of-Parliament office, all of us have our out-of-Parliament offices leased in our own name. These are not leased in the name of parliamentary services. They all have a clause in them that says that the lease terminates 1 month after the person ceases to be a member of Parliament. Now, if the person on polling day thinks that they have been re-elected as a member of Parliament, all by the narrowest of margins, they're not going to terminate their lease. If 3 weeks later they're out again, they will have 1 week left of the 1 month payment that they can get post-polling day, but they will still be liable for a whole month on the lease of that out-of-Parliament office. So they will effectively end up out of their own personal pocket paying for something over which they had no control. So they lease the office to serve constituents and to provide constituency services for the 3 weeks immediately after the election. They'll continue to supply those services, that's fine. Then, with only 1 week of their 1 month notice period left to go, they then have to pay for the remaining 3 or 4 weeks of their notice period out of their own pocket. That's not fair. It's a minor technical issue, but for a Member of Parliament making the adjustment, having just lost their job, I think we should be fair to those members and make sure we make adequate provision for that in the legislation. Well, I'm not the person that's affected by it. The Chris Ockenvold clause, maybe. But moving to the other issue around post-election arrangements, it is to do with the inconsistency in the bill relates to the salary calculation for a member who has ceased to be a member, stood for re-election but ceases to be a member. Because in the explanatory note, it suggests that someone who is not a Speaker, Deputy Speaker, Minister or Under-Secretary will be paid at the backbencher, the salary rate of an ordinary member. Yet in the actual legislation itself, it suggests that the member who has not been returned for the 3 months that they will continue to receive their pay will be paid effectively at the rate that they were paid at on election day. So if they were a select committee chair or a whip or somebody who held some other office that was not Speaker, Deputy Speaker, Minister or Under-Secretary, by the explanatory note, they'd only be paid at the rate of an ordinary member for the 3 months after their election, but by the actual wording of the legislation, by my understanding of the reading of it, they'd be paid at whatever they were being paid on election day. And so I think that's going to need to be clarified, because around all of these things, it's just a question of getting the clarity right, because you don't want ambiguity when in these circumstances. These are people who have just lost their jobs, they're trying to get on with their lives. We just need to be fair to former members and outgoing members, make sure that they know what they are entitled to access in terms of their pay when they cease to be members of Parliament. So some clarity around that will be important. The bill introduces formally in legislation the informal and voluntary reporting regime that we have in place at the moment for members' expenses. That is something that has been widely welcomed, not just by the media but by the public as well. And I think that legislating for that, making that a formal requirement now rather than a voluntary regime, is a welcome step. It's good progress, and that's something that the Labor Party will certainly be supporting. Much has been made in the earlier parts of the debate about the absent MP clause in this. I do sometimes wonder, sitting here, though, whether in fact we should be more worried about some of the MPs who arrive at Parliament and whether or not in fact we're getting value for money out of them. But those are not matters. Those are not matters. Those are not matters that are going to be dealt with by this piece of legislation. Those are matters for another day. They are matters for the electorate, in fact. And in 2014, when they return a Labour government, I'm sure that they will have no qualms about the fact that they are getting exceptionally good value for money from the newly resurgent Labour Party that they will see post-2014. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.